Okay, and we are live and recording. We are on our December 19th meeting. On the roadmap, we are almost done. Got a couple of cleanup topics today, and then Friday is our final review. Remember, it's 2 hours long, so hopefully your schedule will allow you to participate for the entire 2 hours. And today we have David, Amit, Joseph is actually not going to be here, so we'll have to do a little group think on SSO and Canvas. And then we have Satish. Jeff, I'm going to mute you. Okay, there we go. All right, David, I'm going to turn it over to you for connected app settings as they relate to identity and access management. So take it away.
Okie dokie. The heck is this sharing thing again? There it is. Okie dokie. Good morning. I'm half asleep and did this late, so hopefully I don't look too stupid while doing it. As hopefully by now you guys have realized I do have a sense of humor. So where in Salesforce are you connected app management? I had my little Where's Waldo. Thought it'd be funny to tell with that. In typical Salesforce manner, I'm not sure if this was actually on the exam or not, but there's two ways to think about this. You can control these managed apps as a system admin and also as a user, which I did not really pay attention to thinking about it as a user standpoint. So in typical Salesforce manner, there is multiple ways to skin the cat, unfortunately. And in typical exam, they probably want us to know all the ways to skin the cat. So if we're going to go ahead and manage these apps on the admin side, there's two paths to get there. The first method is obviously through setup and the connected apps settings. And if you click on Manage Connected Apps, you will be presented with a list of all the apps that you have that are connected.
Hey, David, can I interrupt you for a second? Are you
Sure.
clicking as you're presenting? Because I'm
Yes.
showing your first screen. So can you?
Oh, did not change at all?
No.
All right,
So
let's try
you just stop sharing and restart. Usually that fixes it.
Let's try this.
Unless you're only sharing your PowerPoint and you're showing us things in Salesforce and you didn't share the Salesforce browser, that could be the other thing that's happening.
Nope. All right, let's try it again. A window. That. Do you see something else now?
Actually, I'm still frozen on your sharing. Guys, are other folks on the call? Maybe it's just my computer. Are you seeing a refresh, and were you seeing slides move when David was talking?
No.
There was no slide moving right now. I don't see any slides.
Yeah, I was seeing your mouse moving though, David. So maybe it's something the way you're presenting.
Let's try. Hey, we're going to do it differently. We'll just try a whole screen then. Let's see what it does. Lovely 4K monitors. All right. Do you see a different screen now?
Well, I see. Where are we clicking around at?
Okay, so that's different than we had before. Do you see?
I see you going to. Yes. Okay. Now we're good.
Okay. Thank you, Google. Okay. So I was saying, and also I already uploaded this presentation, so at least covered my butt. In typical Salesforce, there are multiple ways to skin the cat. And if there's two paths to do it under an admin. Obviously, both of them are still through setup, but setup on their connected apps. And if you click on Manage Connected Apps with a little red arrow, you will be presented with a list of all the apps that are connected. Makes some sense. If you obviously click on the Edit button, you will be brought up, choosing the app, you will be brought up to this screen. Screens where you can do a bunch of settings. As I said, there's multiple ways to skin the cat. On the admin side, if you go back to App Manager, you're brought with the same exact list of connected apps, but a little bit more. And you can click on the down arrow, click on Manage, and again, you are brought to, oh, wait, we've seen this screen before. But this time it shows the settings, but you can click on Edit Policies, and then you are brought back to that screen again. So what do all these little screens mean? Because obviously that has some value on the settings. The start URL, mobile start URL, this is the base URL for the application that you have connected, that you can manage. You can do it. The second section is the OAuth policies. This one has the permitted users where it's kind of interesting on who can use it. Obviously, the typical red bars means it's required. All users can either self-authorize or if it's admin approved, users are pre-authorized. This is a permission setting. They can go ahead and just get into it and not have to do anything else at all. The IP relaxation, there's 4 settings in there. The normal policies through IP restriction. You can also relax it just for refresh tokens. You can relax it for activated devices, which is, I'm not familiar with what that meant. Actually, I think that has to sort of do with IoT devices, though. And relax IP completely, which obviously, I mean, that part I can figure out. The next section is the on-premise high assurance session requirement, which is where we had talked about, I think, in the 2nd or 3rd class. This is where you would set it. Enable user provisioning, and this is where people can go ahead and create, update, delete, but you can't replace, so no CRUD, user accounts in the connected app based upon the users in Salesforce. Then we have how we can mess around things on the personal level. So obviously on our little setup menu, if we click on settings, there is connections where we can see the connected apps that we personally have set up, and here we can go ahead and revoke them. We can't re-add them, but we can revoke them. We can add new ones. And that was it. And this is a good guide for where we're at on this topic.
Yeah, very cool. When I was taking the exam, I had not looked deeply enough into what you can do on the connected app settings, and there was some question about user provisioning related to connected apps, and I did not remember that you could provision them directly from the connected app settings page. And then also the high assurance, could not remember if there was a way to set high assurance on connected apps. So thank you for pointing those out. Those are definitely critical pieces of information to have. All right. Well, thank you, David. Let's see. Amit is not on. Joseph is not on. Satish, you are on. So we're going to jump over to you on deep linking. We'll see if Amit joins us before we're ready.
I'll just need a couple of minutes. I'm driving in. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
So just a couple of minutes. Maybe we can discuss about Canvas. And
yeah, let's talk about Canvas. Okay, so SSO for Canvas. Has anybody had experience working with Canvas? Anybody want to talk about what are the key things we want to know about working with Canvas?
I've touched on it, but not hands-on. I can generally talk at the high level what's involved.
Okay.
Obviously, there is a connected app that's involved as part of Canvas, and this is something that you typically use when you have when you're building an external, user interface that you want to be embedded within Salesforce. And traditionally, Salesforce doesn't let you you bring in because of security concerns, right? So bring in a user interface seamlessly unless you have a Canvas SDK and also single sign-on enabled. The reason why single sign-on is needed, my understanding is that because once you have, let's say Tableau is a good example, right? So in my company, there was a need for us to look at some of the reports with data that's not in Salesforce. But our policies also is that if it doesn't belong to the CRM and it's an enterprise in data, it's sort of sensitive. We don't want to store it. I know there are a few ways to again skin the cat, like David was saying. But one of the ways to do that is have, let's say, your Tableau reports, and at the same time have them right within, let's say, account tab or a contacts tab or a cases tab. and allow that deep linking and allow drill in, like you're clicking on the report within the accounts tab. It's showing right down there, and you can click into it and you can get deeper into it without even knowing that it's a different app. And the way you do that is obviously you have single sign-on and also have a connected app. And Canvas lets you, have that seamless experience. So this is very, very high level, 4,000 foot explanation of my experience with it. But when I was going through the documentation, there's a lot of stuff in terms of how you do set it up. And I'm not an expert at that.
Okay, well, that's good information. Page I found most helpful. I will share it with you here. Is in the Canvas Developer Guide. I did not read the whole thing, and I don't think it's necessary to read the whole thing to be able to pass the exam. But this information on the SAML single sign-on section is important, and it talks about, as Satish mentioned, you want to have that single sign-on enabled so that Canvas app shows up seamlessly for the user. And then depending on how you're doing your implementation, you're going to want to use one of these two methods, either the refresh signed request method if you're doing JavaScript, or if you want to handle the refresh of the session on the server side instead of on the client side, then you would want to use the repost method instead. And I don't remember why. It has to do something with the fact that basically you're redoing single sign-on and you need that assertion to come through again. I don't remember where exactly that is in the documentation. But important information to remember, refresh signed request used for client side, aka JavaScript. Repost used for server side, and this is, pick your language kind of thing if you don't want to use JavaScript. There was a question on the exam. I don't remember the specifics, but one of the key pieces of information was that the developers of the app that they were considering for Canvas were willing to do some minor JavaScript implementation kind of work. And so that kind of led me to think, okay, well, they would probably use like this refresh signed request method. They could do it as a Canvas app versus a connected app, which actually I'll open that up for discussion. When would you use a connected app, and when is it better to use a Canvas app? Which one do you pick? I'm opening this one up to the floor.
So, Natalya, what was that question? When would we use connected app? Was it?
Well, let me ask that a little differently. So when would you use the app launcher to just send the user directly to like a different connected app, like outside of Salesforce? And when would you want to embed it as a Canvas app inside Salesforce? In what circumstances would you go each way?
That would be, I think, depending on what the use case is, because when you go into App Launcher and you're basically clicking on that link, and it redirects you to a different server altogether through SSO channel, that just basically you're now switching from Salesforce into another user interface. And if users are okay with that, and a lot of companies are fine with that, they're jumping from one company to another, or even from one Salesforce to another Salesforce, that's okay. But sometimes they want to have, I open a record page, just like Satish was explaining in his case, that you open a record page, and I want to see this thing right there. I want to see my dashboard from Tableau or from some other data warehouse thing important to me. I want to see it right inside Salesforce. And I think that's where where Canvas plays a big role. Where historically how it came about is because of the security issues. You couldn't just bring in some random app. In the past, like if I remember 10 years ago, you actually could do this with Salesforce with some trickery, bypassing some stuff. But then they blocked all the ports, all the different things from what you could do with JavaScript. And so now all this cross-site scripting, cross-domain stuff is not allowed, especially with Lightning. Like you can't just stick stuff in there from external applications. So Canvas SDK is sort of this wrapper around your external apps that brings it in and allows it to display in this iframe window inside Salesforce, and it still can lively interact. You can deep link it and go back and forth and still remain within Salesforce. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Igor was saying. So iframes are obviously something that are restricted And if you need the deep experience, there are two options. One is you build an app exchange package, install it, or if you want to run as a runtime environment, still separate from Salesforce, right? Then you use the Canvas SDK and you get that deep experience within the page.
Yeah, and I think one of the key components there, like Satish was explaining, I guess with managed package, or for example, I've built apps in the past that inside Salesforce look at different data, but these are API level integrations, which means that I build a Lightning component that talks to a Apex controller in the back. That Apex controller makes various requests on my behalf, using secure credentials to connect to this external system, not with SSO, any other thing. It just connects to my internal system, either via MuleSoft or some other services, brings the data back in my API, reinterprets it, and I build my whole new UI. So I build UI in Salesforce based on data I receive in API, which is a lot of work. It's a lot of sort of detailed development work needed for that. Whereas Canvas is just like, you don't have to rebuild anything. You just kind of stick your URL in there, you stick your app inside, and you're good to go. It's much quicker path, but you got to deal with SSO configuration and some of the security stuff, and that kind of put it in that Canvas container box, if you will.
Yeah, that's cool. Hopefully that was helpful. So I think, Natalya, you're either on mute or we can't hear you. But
Yep, I sure am. Sorry.
yeah. So I'm ready to present.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, I will stop presenting then and we'll send it over to you.
So you should be able to see my screen. I mean, this is really, deep linking was my topic. It's fairly simple. And I think I'll touch upon a few things. Obviously, if you do a wiki, or I think a lot of us already know what these are from our experience with websites and links. But once web applications became pretty prevalent, obviously secure web applications became very prevalent. Then there's also a need to get deep inside the application. For example, this is an example of a deep link where there is an application and it's actually going to a record, like in this case, a case record, versus my homepage where I log in and then traverse and navigate to that case. Really, that's what deep link is. It's a link that takes you directly to the record or the info or the resource, right? So I guess, why do we need this, right? So I think both from a general perspective and even from a Salesforce perspective, the advantage is that it's user adoption. It lets you easily access the resource that you want to go to, and saves you that time from having to click multiple times, right? How is this related to identity and access management and single sign-on, right? So for you to be able to enable deep link, especially on an authenticated site where you can't just get to that link because there is, you have to be a user, a valid user, and you have to be also having access to that specific data. First, Salesforce needs to be able to authenticate you, right? And from Salesforce can do this even though you don't have a external identity provider. That's because Salesforce internally is also using an ID provider, right? You know that Salesforce is by default an identity provider, right? But if, let's say, you are using an external identity provider, then the only way to get to this deep link is through a service provider initiated login flow. And again, this is something that I've read on the in the documentation. It was challenging. Maybe is there an easier way to even do it from IDP flows? I don't know if that is for a fact that there are limitations there, but it would be pretty hard. I can imagine, like you would have to pretty much construct that IDP URL with some sort of a parameter that takes you back. And I know there's an example of that down in my presentation. I'll share that. But typically, this is done through a service provider initiated login flow, right? And again, it is deep linking is achieved through that URL parameter, right? It's the relay state URL parameter is what allows you to sort of the ID provider to take and relay it back to the original URL that the user intended to go, right, rather than just the domain. Again, my domain is a requirement for this. So in the exam, you might get this question is, right, and what do you need? I mean, you obviously need my domain so that you have a specific domain that you can enable single sign-on on with the service provider initiated login flow. That's the high-level stuff. And I think if I were to just show this, obviously now I'm clicking on the record. And so again, a service provider would have to support this. It's not just that it's an SSO thing. A service provider also should be able to take a URL and redirect once the authentication has been done, be able to get into that URL. So give me a second here while I copy the password. And as I log back in, now I'm not redirected to my default home page. I'm directed right to that contact, right? The URL that we just typed. So that's how the experience is. And let me go back here and see what else I have. Yeah, so there's this other interesting thing. I think we may have covered this, or we probably will be covering this. But this is the Salesforce One login flow, and I think we talked a little bit about this. And I thought it's interesting to sort of bring this up because of that. When you search through the Salesforce documentation, you also see this deep link, right? So in a mobile world, the deep links have a little more more challenges than what you would normally see. Because of either the app not even being there, or the link is the link is not capable of once the app is installed going back to the content once the app gets installed to the App Store. So there are all other challenges, but I think for our purposes, we don't need to get into that. But this is interesting because here, Salesforce One, the way the authentication flow works is there are several steps. It initially uses the SAML because it's a hybrid application. It has the web browser component in it. It's not really the native application like you would imagine. So what it does is it does the SP, it redirects to the identity provider, and the identity provider goes and issues a SAML token and then redirects it back to the service provider. And somewhere in that flow, there is also this deep link to the OAuth way to authenticate, and that's how the OAuth flow takes on. And then it starts to get a access token, a high entropy access token using that flow, and eventually establishes a access token. I thought this was interesting, but I don't think this from a deep link perspective. I don't know if it'll come in the exam, but if they might ask us from a Salesforce One perspective, if you haven't gone through this is something that we should be able to go. And I thought something I wanted to highlight is that relay state parameter. I think that's all I have.
Yeah, somebody mentioned this in another session, that relay state parameter, every service provider supports that differently. or every, I can't remember, the service provider or the identity provider, but you have to check and see what they can do with that relay state parameter. Igor, maybe you that mention?
Yeah, that was I think it was my presentation around SSO and single sign-on with Salesforce. But I'd like to make comments here at what Satish just mentioned, since it kind of touched on some mobile components. So one thing to remember is that, yes, Salesforce One is very easy to say, but everywhere in the exam, I remember there were probably at least 10 questions or so mentioning mobile. And it was always spelling it out, it's Salesforce Mobile. And when they say that, it's Salesforce Mobile App that they're talking about, which is what we know as Salesforce One. Just kind of a terminology so that people don't get confused as you read it carefully, make sure that it is a Salesforce Mobile App that they're referring to in the question. So they will never say it's Salesforce One, it will say Salesforce Mobile.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think, so if it is a native application, a hybrid application, actually it doesn't matter. The OAuth flow would typically always use a browser, and native applications are no different than hybrid app. If they are built with Salesforce Mobile SDK, they both will follow exactly the same path. So it doesn't matter that I have a hybrid app that has embedded web view, it won't be using that web view for that login screen. It will come from Salesforce as an external redirect. And mobile SDK will take care of that. If I build my own app without mobile SDK, then I have to perform that dance on my own, whether hybrid or native, and that web view won't be helping me in much ways, because it's really embedded browser with some of the like Cordova, PhoneGap, or something else. So this is just, none of that will be on the test, as I recall. But something interesting I remember was there was a number of questions that were revolving around deep linking. Some of them were just spelled out, said like, hey, we're doing deep linking. Others will give you a scenario that maps out that at the end of the scenario, if you read the whole thing, it's like, well, oh, they're talking about deep link. And then they will ask series of questions of picking, what are requirements, like you mentioned before, might be like, what do you need to actually support this? So yes, you need my domain, you need SSO, a single sign-on, or SAML, and there will be a number of terminology that we'll be asking, querying for. So just keep that in mind.
That's very useful. Thanks, Igor.
Okay. Thank you, Satish. I don't see that Amit has joined us, so we were also supposed to cover single sign-on for mobile. And actually, Satish, between you and Igor, you guys have done a good job of covering that already, in a lot of good detail. But the only other thing I could say about SSO for mobile is that if you set up single sign-on, you want to direct users to the custom domain option, and they will just need to do that the first time they go into their mobile app to send to that point. Also, the other thing was IP restrictions, that you might want to consider relaxing IP restrictions for mobile users because they're mobile. So they're probably not going to be using the mobile app at their office, and they probably won't be using the mobile app from their home. They're most likely going to be using it when they're out on the road visiting clients. And so if you have IP restrictions locked down, you're really not giving them a good user experience. Anybody else want to comment on what we would want to consider for mobile?
Yeah.
So would that be I'm sorry for interrupting, would that be the activated devices section?
Well, activated devices is just the first time you go to Salesforce from a device that Salesforce hasn't seen before. Like, let's say you got a new mobile phone or you got a new laptop that you haven't connected with before. That's what the activated device is. And I don't think it refers to, and maybe it's for IoT as well. But generally, I saw activated devices and I thought of it as, oh, Salesforce doesn't recognize this new computer that I'm using, or Salesforce doesn't recognize this new phone that I'm using.
Yeah, I would recommend going through the Manage Connected App, and actually, if you can, try to access your org using Salesforce One, download it. The very first time you do it, it'll install the app. You will not see Salesforce One unless you actually do it. So once it installs it, then what you do is you go check out the policies, right? Policies like Natalya mentioned and Igor mentioned. A lot of these questions could be around, what could you do? For example, even for a mobile user, right? There is this PIN that you can enable, and you can enable the PIN to be required in any of these minutes, and then you can have there's a PIN complexity. This is sort of not quite that second factor, but it's sort of an additional protection. And this PIN is really tied to the session, in my experience, since we did this at our company. The moment the session expires, that means that your access token, right, or the session itself expires. The PIN also expires. So there were some interesting things in our company with info security on because they were very strict on the session, but they also wanted us to have the PIN. And this was this bad experience of people having to create the PIN every time they lose the session. You actually have to create it, and not just. So it is tied to the session. I don't know in the exam if they do talk about it. So then there is stuff here that is not quite obvious, which I don't know if the exam they'll ask you, is that the transaction security policy also applies to all of the sessions, including even the mobile session, right? So you can control, maybe put some geofencing in there, or other kinds of interesting things in there if you wanted to. Those are the few things that I know from a mobile perspective might come up, right? Igor, I mean, I don't know what else they're asking on mobile.
Yeah, I remember there was at least 10 questions that I could probably think of that mentioned mobile, and some of them talked about the actual custom mobile app built with SDK, and some specifically say it's Salesforce mobile. So it's important to differentiate those two, because obviously when the questions are around your developers in your organization building a Salesforce mobile app, and the question will be phrased something like that. They're like, they're building or they already built one. That means you have a mobile team. That means you have mobile developers who can modify the code, who can change your security keys, who could add many features to the app, obviously. Whereas Salesforce One or Salesforce Mobile is set by Salesforce. So those are kind of important differentiators. But there are a number of questions around. There's actually, now you mentioned the pin. I do remember there was one question that mentioned the pin, but the pin was not really. It was just there as a distracting thing. It was not really talking about pin or necessity to set up a pin. But they just mentioned it in one of the answers that, hey, you set up a pin as two-factor authentication or something of that sort. So it's kind of, I don't recall it being emphasized on the exam itself.
Yeah, but I don't remember any questions about a pin.
I remembered it was mentioned, but it was not really the answer for that. But one other thing is with SSO and mobile, I think maybe it might be a little bit confusing, because typically when you think of mobile, that's always going to be, especially if it's a mobile app that connects directly to Salesforce, and we're just strictly talking that, then we're talking OAuth really. And that OAuth could be functioning directly with Salesforce, or it could be going through external IDP that Salesforce is connected. Then you have a SAML and single sign-on dance going on. But that's all happening between IDP, Salesforce, and your mobile device, or mobile app, if you will. And so really, if you replace the mobile app with the browser, the same thing exactly happening on a mobile device versus on your browser. So there's really not that much different what you have to set up, other than the fact that I know that there were questions around using my domain, making sure using IDP's domain, like direct in the app, which already been mentioned. And so that's something that to kind of keep in mind what the scenarios. Those are typically questions around scenarios.
Yeah, the only other key point I think for mobile is the refresh tokens, the fact that you might want to set them longer so your user isn't constantly having to re-log in. Because like I know with the Salesforce app, once you log in on it, if you bring it back up, you probably won't have to log in again, depending on how the refresh token policy is set for the app.
Yeah, I think it's because normally, I think it's like a default of like never expire. For that, but the companies may require different policy, and admin may set up a policy of like, hey, I want to expire this token every week or every 40 hours or whatever the time frame is.
Yeah. Okay. So any other thoughts, comments on connected apps, SSO for mobile, SSO for Canvas, or deep linking? Okay, then let's see where we are headed. We are almost done. We have one session left. That session is this Friday. And just a little bit more reading. Again, that link to create a connected app, that is really just go in there, learn all the different things you can do in connected app settings. And the thing that messed with my head for the longest time was, as David mentioned this morning, there's two different places you can go to do connected apps. So part one is you set up the policies, the OAuth scopes and all that, or your SAML settings. But then there's a whole separate section called Manage Connected App, where there's even more policies that you can set. And that's the piece that I had missed for the longest time, was that management setting and all the different things you can do in there. So spend some time, make sure you know what's possible in there.
So Natalya, I just want to clarify that you're saying that you're talking about obviously Lightning interface here. I thought, at least from experience working with connected apps, that manage link is basically getting you to the list of connected apps you can manage. But once you actually go in there, it's the same as you in the connected app and you click that manage policy button.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Right. So the piece I was missing is like, yeah, I knew how to go into a connected app, set my OAuth scopes, And I didn't really click into that manage button very often, and I wish I had, because there's a lot of stuff in there.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So yeah. Link here, Igor, you had talked about this. Know when it's appropriate to use which kind of SSL certificate. Sometimes you have to have a CA signed one, sometimes you don't have to, it's optional. So that's a really good link. It's got some good scenarios on when to use which kind. And then just a review of everything we've covered over the past 14 sessions. Friday, we're going to go round robin. We're going to cover, in 2 hours, we will look at all the different objectives listed in the exam guide, and we're just going to go round robin. Everybody's going to add their own little bit of knowledge and what they think is important to know for the exam. Hopefully everyone can stay for the whole 2 hours so you can get the most benefit out of it, because the best content will come if everybody is on the call. And with that,
real quick question
yeah.
on Friday. I received the invite, and I think there's 2 different group connects for that. One, so is it the same one we're connecting to right now, or is there a brand new one for Friday?
Yeah, because on my calendar, like, the entire invite list disappeared. So when I went to update it to be 2 hours long, like, I had to re-invite everyone. So it should be the same one. It's the VUA blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
Yeah, the same one you connected to today. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Jeff. I'll also point that in the Slack channel, just so people connect to the right one.
Right. So we'll have everybody on the same call. It's easier that way.
Yeah, that would be nice. And yeah, and if you connect and nobody's on the line, then you're probably on the wrong line. So try the other link. Okay, any final thoughts from anybody?
I'm just going to be a person that says thank you very much for putting this on.
Sure, my pleasure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks everybody for playing along. It would, I can organize it all, but if people don't show up and contribute, it's kind of a pointless thing. So.
No, it was very useful, all the discussions.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll pass the exam.
All right. Okay, everybody, we will talk to you all on Friday. Come with all your notes and be ready to share your best nuggets of information about all the information that we've covered. And as always, let's see, recording is now stopping. And
have a good one.
All right. And
Everyone, guys.